Lights, camera, action. It's time to make a scene with the new Lord of the Rings scene boxes revealed at MagicCon Las Vegas last weekend. So let's take a look and see what these things are. So, what specifically is a scene box? Well, it's a specially packed Magic the Gathering product that includes three set boosters, six scene cards in which the art lines up to create a scene from the books, hence the name, as well as an easel and art card variations of those same scene cards that's included in the product, so you can lay out the art cards on the easel and display them. They release on November the 3rd. So now comes the question, are they worth it? Well, let's take a look at the current pre order online pricing. As of September 29th, the day I'm recording this, these scene boxes go for around $39.99 up to $49.99 each. And then if you buy the full set of them, of all four, they range from about $139.99 up to $168.99 for all four of them. It goes without saying, don't buy the ones that are going for the higher prices because you can get them cheaper elsewhere. So by going for the lower end pricing, what is it that you actually get when you break it down? Well, the set boosters right now are going for around $6 on most sites that I checked this morning. So that's about $18 worth of set boosters in this particular product. I'm not going to value the display and the art cards for anything because not everybody cares about them. So that leaves about $22 worth of value needing to come from the actual scene cards to quote unquote break even on your costs for buying one of these if you care about that kind of thing. I will happily say I do believe that any one of these will probably net you that amount back and more due to the value of some of the cards. As of recording, there are no pre-sale data available on individual cards of these things. So I'm going to go ahead and do just a little bit of intuiting on what I believe are the cards that are going to be the most sought after and therefore the most expensive coming out of these things. So let's begin with the Aragorn at Helm's Deep scene box. The nice part about these scene boxes is that each one features a new legendary creature that lets us have access to a new commander. For this scene pictured in the top center, we get Aragorn Hornburg Hero. For one, a red, a green, and a white. You get a 4/4 human soldier that says attacking creatures you control have first strike and renown 1. And it says when a creature with renown 1 deals combat damage to a player, if it's not already renowned, put a counter on it and it becomes renowned. And then whenever a renowned creature you control deals combat damage to a player, double the number of +1/+1 counters on it. So this is a new three-colored Aragorn that cares about +1/+1 counters, and more specifically making your creatures become renowned by dealing combat damage to a player. So once that happens, anytime a renowned creature deals combat damage to a player, all of its +1/+1 counters are doubled. So couple that with things like doubling seasoning or branching evolution to make your own renowned creatures a really big problem in record time, since those counters will be doubled twice for each time they deal combat damage. This also triggers an additional time if you can grant your renowned creatures double strike. So like if it wasn't already renowned and it has double strike, the first strike step will hit, it'll get a counter and become renowned. The second hit will hit, and then those counters are then doubled on the creature. So that's a really powerful ability. As for the rest of the scene, let's take a look at the upper left-hand side with Anduril Narsil Reforged. For two colorless, you get an equipment card with Ascend, which says if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. And it says whenever the equipped creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. But if you have the City's Blessing, the Ascend part, you put two counters on each creature you control instead, and it equips for three colorless. I really like that it synergizes with this variation of Aragorn by putting counters on them so then they can be doubled later when they become renowned and start hitting the opponents. On top of that, it's just a really powerful ability to put counters across all of your creatures for not a lot of cost. Moving over to the top right of the scene is probably the most sought after card from all of the scenes, and it's also being talked about as a legacy contender as well. So that's going to cause the price to go up on Legolas's Quick Reflexes. For a green, you get an instant with Split Second, and it says untap target creature until end of turn it gains hexproof, reach, and whenever it becomes tapped, it deals damage equal to its power to up to one target creature. So if you don't know what Split Second does, it means basically unless your opponents are tapping something for a mana ability, nobody can respond to this spell. It cannot be countered. It cannot be stopped. There's nothing that can be done about this spell other than tapping mana or tapping a mana rock off, just that kind of stuff. And then this goes off and it's already resolved before they can actually do anything with that mana. In terms of one mana protection spells for creatures, this is going to be one of the best ever printed. We have access to an uncounterable, unable to be responded to spell that stops any targeted removal. You can also use this as a defensive measure without the removal considerations to untap a creature that was tapped down to block as a surprise thing. And then if it has like a tap effect, like a mana ability or something like that on it, you can then tap it and use the damaging ability off the last part of this card to shoot something else. So you could actually theoretically take out two attackers with a block and a tap down to do something about it. Then on top of that, we have a third thing this is actually pretty good for. It has some fun potential with major mana producing creatures like Elvish Archdruid or Marwyn the Nurturer, because you're going to be able to untap them and get double the mana out of their abilities. And the bonus with Marwyn is if you get her counters up high enough before you go ahead and use this, you can also use her to blast a creature off the board as you're generating the mana. With so many uses for this card, it's going to be wanted by a lot of players, and the price will be elevated accordingly. Moving to the bottom left of the scene, we have Gimli's Reckless Might. For 3 in a red, you have an enchantment that says creatures you control have haste and formidable whenever you attack. If creatures you control have total power 8 or greater, target attacking creature you control fights up to one target creature you don't control. While this is not the best enchantment for granting all of our creatures haste, the formidable trigger does have its uses in decks that can take advantage of larger creatures to get the trigger to go off and survive the forced fight while attacking through. It does fit very nicely with this variation of Aragorn included in the scene because you're going to be pumping up your creatures with the Narsil, with the renown triggers off of him, and it's just going to make them better to work with this particular enchantment. The fifth card from this scene is Isengard Unleashed. For 2 and triple red. You get a sorcery that says damage cannot be prevented this turn. If a sorcery you control would deal damage this turn to an opponent or a permanent they control, it deals triple that damage instead, and it has flashback of 4 and triple red. So the last few years, Magic has been on a real big theme in red of tripling damage as just a way to give red some more finishing ability, and has come in the form of enchantments like City on Fire from the March of Machines set, and Fire Emancipation, first printed in M21, but it was just recently reprinted as an Enchanted Tales card in Wilds of Eldraine. This is the same thing, but instead it's a one-shot sorcery that can be done again with flashback, though most players would likely just set it up to blow out the entire board the first time you go ahead and cast it. Personally, I like that red is getting a new way to end the game on the spot that's not Insurrection stealing everybody else's creatures to win the game there. Otherwise, your only other option is usually Savage Beating, which is a one-shot win con to give all your stuff double strike and additional attack phases. It also works outside of combat damage, unlike Savage Beating, so you can get a little more mileage out of the direct damage sources that you have as well, and at least this gives a great rate and can be stacked up with the earlier mentioned enchantments, because as they will multiply and stack, tripling damage and then tripling it again. The final card from this scene in the lower right is Rohirrim Chargers. For 2 and a red white. You get a 4/4 human knight. You may exert them as they attack. And whenever you exert a creature, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an equipment card. Put that card into the battlefield attached to that creature, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. While not exactly groundbreaking as a red-white equipment-focused creature, because we had lots of that in the last few years, I do like that it synergizes with the older Exert creatures from the Amonkhet block if you want to use those in a deck, and it also fits the other scene card here with Anduril, because it gets to dig deeper into the deck to hunt it down. Just remember that if it has an attack trigger attached to it, like this version of Anduril, it will not trigger because the declare attack step of the attack phase has already happened, and the creature that had to be exerted to get the trigger has already attacked. Let's move on to the second scene. We have the Might of Galadriel. The legendary creature that comes here is Galadriel, Light of Valinor. For 2, a green, a white, and a blue, you get a 3/3 elf noble with Alliance, which is basically whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you trigger something. And on this card, it says choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn, and there's 3 choices. So if a creature comes into play, you can either add triple green, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, or scry 2 and then draw a card. So if you have multiple creatures come in, you can pick another one that's on here that hasn't already been done. So, get 3 creatures on the board, you get to do all 3. If you have the ability to flash in creatures or make tokens on an opponent's turn, you can get the alliance triggers on their turns as well. We haven't seen an interesting Bant colored commander to build around in a while, and you can use the parts of the Elven Council Precon that was printed back in the summertime to assist in building around this version of Galadriel if you want to stick with the Lord of the Rings cards. To the left of Galadriel in this scene is Arboreal Alliance. For X green green, you get an enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, create an XX green tree folk creature token, and whenever you attack with one or more elves, populate, which means you can pick a token on the board and make a copy of it. So this is kind of interesting. You make a tree folk, then as long as you're playing with other elves, I mean, a Gladriel you can attack, but I don't know how well I want to put a 3/3 into combat that often. You get to populate that particular token. I do like the idea of making a wall of creatures, and it works well with this Galadriel because then you can drop, something like a 1 mana elf, net 2 mana to drop into this, and then cast it straight, or you can go ahead and have it come in with a bonus counter on it with Galadriel's abilities. The other side of Galadriel on the right, we have Rally the Galadrim. For two, a green and a blue, you get a sorcery that says create a token that's a copy of a target creature you control. So, your standard clone, but it also has Conspire, which means as you cast a spell, tap two untapped creatures that share a color with Rally the Galadrim. When you do, copy the spell and choose new targets for the copy. I personally love clone spells, and I like the ability to conspire this to get two clones. That is totally sign me up. Multiple copies of something like, I don't know, Elvish Archdruid or an Elvish War Master. That sounds like a good time to me. On the bottom left of the scene is Galadriel's Dismissal. For a white, instant speed, kicker, two and a white. So for two colorless and two white, you get to kick it out. Target creature phases out. If the spell was kicked, each creature target player controls phases out instead. So basically, they just cease to exist in the game until the beginning of their next upkeep. Without a doubt, this will be the chase card for this particular scene. There are so many applications for Galadriel's Dismissal. The obvious line is to kick it and phase out all of your own creatures to save them from an opposing board wipe. But you can also save your stuff from your own board wipe by phasing them out first and then nuking everything else on the board. The less obvious line is to go ahead and use it to phase out all of an opponent's defensive creatures and then running your horde of creatures headlong into said opponent's life total, likely removing them from the game. The side of the dismissal is Mists of Lorien. For two and a blue, you get a sorcery with Replicate of a blue. Return target non-land permanent and each other non-land permanent with the same mana value as that permanent to their owner's hand. So this is an interesting take on a massive bounce spell. You target something with it, and all permanents that have the same mana value get returned to the player's hands. But the thing here you got to remember is it will balance everything that you have that matches the mana cost as well. So you got to plan accordingly if you don't want something coming back to your hand. But as you replicate this and target things, more and more of the board will get bounced back to players' hands. The last card in this scene is Galadrim Brigade. For two and a green, you get a 2/2 elf soldier with squad, one and a green. Means as you cast it, pay an extra one and a green as many times as you want, and this creature will enter and create that many token copies of this card. And it just says other elves you control get +1/+1. So you get an elf lord card that you can basically self clone out onto the board. I love this thing in an elf deck. Lord's cards are kind of the bread and butter of any sort of deck where creature types matter. And being able to clone itself with its squad ability kind of gives you a virtual cheat in Commander because it gives you the feel of having multiple copies of this particular card in your deck. It also works great as a target for Rally the Galadrim, and it's a great populate target for Arboreal Alliance as long as you squad up a token copy when you cast the spell. Moving along to the third scene, we're going to go ahead and take a look at Gandalf in Pelennor Fields. The legendary here is Gandalf of the Secret Fire. For a colorless blue, red, white, you get a 3/4 Avatar Wizard that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand during an opponent's turn, exile that card with 3 time counters on it instead of putting it into your graveyard as it resolves. Then, if the exile card didn't already have Suspend, it gains Suspend. And that means that it's going to get 3 time counters on it, and then at the beginning of each of your upkeeps, it's going to lose a time counter, and when the last one comes off, you get to cast the spell. So aside from the encyclopedia that's printed on this card, it is very powerful. I do find it odd that they put sorcery on it, though, because that means you'll have to run cards like Vidalcan Orrery or Leyline of Anticipation to give your spells flash so you can get that part of the card to work. But being able to get double use out of your spells is very, very strong. An example here would be you cast Lightning Bolt, blasting away a creature on your opponent's turn. It gets suspended for 3 turns, and you're going to be able to do it again 3 turns later and blast something else or just dome somebody in the head for 3. And the only caveat is that you have to start off by casting it off turn. Unlike the first 2 scenes we looked at, Gandalf is actually on the bottom of this particular scene, so let's jump back to the top and we'll get into Olorin Searing Light. For 2 colorless, a red and a white, you get an instant that says each opponent exiles a creature with the greatest power among creatures that player controls, and it has spell masteries, which means if there are 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard, As you cast this spell, it deals damage to each opponent equal to the power of the creature that was exiled. That is one big oof of a removal spell. For one more mana than most cards that make opponents sacrifice their highest power creature, instead we get to exile it from the game, which is so much better in most cases. And then you have the Spellmaster trigger that can really do a chunk of damage if they're playing some large chunky stuff anyways. I, for one, cannot wait to exile a Blightsteel Colossus with this and dome its controller for a quarter of their life for 4 mana. Then we have Sorceress Squall for 6 triple blue. We have a sorcery with Delve, which means when you cast it, you exile any number of cards from your graveyard, and it costs 1 less for each one you've exiled. Target opponent mills 9 cards. Then you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from among that player's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If the spell will be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. For its full cost, this is a little bit of a weak spell, but ideally you're going to be paying only the triple blue part of the spell by delving away other stuff from your graveyard. But this could be brutal if someone's relying upon a specific spell for their strategy and you get to cast it for yourself and exile it from the game. That's a big ouch. Also, it's kind of fun being able to use someone else's deck to try to find answers for things that are vexing you. The last card in the top row is Ramus Ekor, Ancient Shield. For 3 and a white, you get a legendary artifact that says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, draw a card and then create a 0/3 white wall token with Defender. At the beginning of combat on your turn, creatures you control with Defender gain Exalted until end of turn. Now, this is a very odd card. I get creating 0/3 walls with Defender and drawing cards off of the second spell mechanic. That's great. And it's also a great way to keep heat off of you as you build up a spell slinger deck. But Defender cards gaining Exalted, it doesn't make a ton of sense here. And with most Defender decks that have the ability to let them attack, those are either in Bant or Abzan colors because you need the green part to animate the walls. That means it really doesn't fit here for the theme on that part of the card. It's kind of like a half a card here. On the bottom left is Courageous Resolve. For 2 and a white, you get an instant that says up to 1 target creature you control gains protection from each of your opponents until end of turn. Draw a card. And it also has Fateful Hour. If you have 5 or less life, you can't lose the life this turn, you can't lose the game this turn, and opponents can't win the game this turn. So this is a multi-purpose card that can be used defensively or offensively. It's also the first card we've ever seen that gives protection from an opponent. Not a color, not from creatures, but from anything each of your opponents can do to or against the creature that was targeted by this. As a bonus, the spell has Fateful Hour, which at 5 or less life adds a variation of the card Angel's Grace to the spell, saving your bacon as well as the creature. But that's all defensive stuff. I did say this does work offensively as well, and that protection from opponents also has a piece of reminder text that the creature cannot be blocked either. So if you need a push to finish off an opponent, or maybe you're playing a Voltron style commander, this will guarantee that someone's going to get KO'd by commander damage if they don't respond to this spell and kill their commander. The last card in this scene is Fell Beast Shriek. For a blue-red, you get a sorcery that says each opponent chooses a creature they control, tap and goad the chosen creatures, and it has Splice onto instant or sorcery for 2 blue and a red. Now, while this card is not amazing by any stretch, it does revisit an ability not seen since the original Kamigawa block, Splice. Now, originally this ability only allowed you to pay the Splice on a spell by playing arcane spells that came in that block, and then you got to splice the ability onto an arcane spell. This is a much improved variation where it can be spliced onto any instant or sorcery. You're not restricted to just arcane spells. So this means that anytime you can cast an instant or sorcery, if you have an extra 2 blue-red laying around, you can splice this onto the spell, making it so you can keep the Shriek in your hand and use it repeatedly. The splice also gets around the spell's sorcery speed timing, because the splice actually allows you to add its effects to any instant you cast. Let's take a look at the fourth and final scene box. We have Flight of the Witch King. The aforementioned Witch King Sky Scourge is a legend included here. For 5 black red, you get a 5/5 Wraith Noble with flying. Whenever you attack with 1 or more Wraiths, exile the top X cards of your library where X is their total power. You may play those cards this turn, and he has Undying, which means when this thing dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, it returns to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. This brings us up to four variations of the Witch King, two that are mono black, this one being Rakdos colors, and the fourth is the Lord of the Nazgul, which came in the precon, which is basically the closest variation to this one that in that it actually cares about wraiths and the things that they do on the board. And this actually slots nicely into a thematic wraith deck that could be led by one of the three color Saurons. I should say, if you can afford the small mint, that it'll cost you to get the 9 Nazgul for the deck, but hey, Watsy, make these things easier to get. On the top left of this scene is Call Forth the Tempest. For 5 triple red, you get a sorcery with Cascade, Cascade. It says, Call Forth the Tempest deals damage to each creature your opponents control equal to the total mana value of other spells you've cast this turn. So in essence, this is an 8 drop, gets you double Cascade on them, and then this thing can actually burn more away. So what you're going to get is you're going to get the double Cascade triggers, 2 free spells, and then the damage that this deals is equal to the 2 spells that you've cascaded plus anything else you might have played before you drop this. But in all likelihood, you're probably just casting this for 8, getting 2 7 or less drops, and then burning away the board. We'll note this will only hit your opponent's creatures, not your own. Next to that, we have the Nazgul Battle Mace. For 5 colorless, you get an equipment that equips for 3 colorless. Equipped creature has Menace, Death Touch, and Annihilator 1. And whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control unless that player pays 3 life. Well, that's a pile of keywords that this one equipment can grant, and one of which is one that many players hate in Annihilator, which kind of feeds the second part of the card, turning the equipped creature into an It That Betrays. If they don't pay 3 life, you're gonna get whatever that permanent is. Then, if the opponent wants the pain to stop coming their way, they're going to have to double block to get rid of the creature, and then unless they have indestructible blockers, they're going to lose both because this thing grants Death Touch as well. It's a very devastating equipment, and it will find a home in just about every equipment-based deck out there, and this is also one of the most talked about cards from this scene. On the lower left, we have Mordor on the March. For 3 black red, you get a sorcery that says exile a creature card from your graveyard, create a token that's a copy of it. It gains haste until end of turn, exile the copy at the beginning of the next end step, and the spell has Storm. So for those that don't know what Storm is, for every card you cast before you cast Mordor on the March, you create a copy of Mordor on the March. So this is an interesting take on a quote-unquote reanimator strategy, as it exiles the creature from the graveyard, but then gives you a hasty win now use that can hit multiple creatures if you're able to cast a few cheap spells before using this on the board. Next to that is the Fell Beast of Mordor. For 2 black, you get a 3/3 Drake Beast with Flying, Devour 1, which means as it enters, you can sacrifice any number of creatures, and it puts that many +1/+1 counters on the Fell Beast of Mordor. And when it enters the battlefield or attacks, target opponent loses X life, and you gain X life equal to the number of counters on the Fell Beast. This is the mount of the Nazgul as they attacked Minas Tirith, and in the card version, it can do some big swipes of damage if you have enough creatures to sacrifice to it as it comes into play, and then you get to do it over and over again with each attack. My only qualm about this card, in order to maximize it, I think you're going to have to go into something like a zombie deck that can spin out a lot of tokens to feed into the Devour. Otherwise, you're just going to use it as a bit of chip damage and it's not really all that special at 4 mana. And then the last card in this particular scene is Minas Morgul, Dark Fortress. It's a legendary land that says when it enters the battlefield, it comes in tapped, taps for a black, and then 3 in a black, put a shadow counter on target creature. For as long as that creature has a shadow counter on it, it is a wraith in addition to its other types. Now, this may not seem like a very powerful ability, but if you're building a wraith-based deck with the Nazgul, this is actually quite powerful. Because if you're lacking wraiths, but you have other creatures on the board, you can just turn them into wraiths. And I can see kind of a fun combo here with this scene itself. Because what you do is you use Minas Morgul to turn the Fell Beast of Mordor into a wraith, and then with the Nazgul I talked about before, every time you get a ring temp trigger, it's also going to make the Fell Beast grow, which makes its attack trigger better. Minas Morgul also allows us to make other stuff into wraiths to get the Lord of the Nazgul to go off that much faster. So what's my verdict after going through all these cards? Are these things worth getting? Well, sort of. I would say that it's up to the playstyle that speaks to you. What I would not do is buy these if you aren't in the market for all 6 cards coming from each one of them, as you're likely to pick up most of these for not very much, save for a couple of cards that I pointed out, like Galadriel's Dismissal and Legolas's Quick Reflexes. Far and away, the Gandalf one, in my opinion, is the least favorite of these things, and also has the one card that just feels out of place compared to the other ones with the legendary artifact card. The Aragorn one, though, it speaks to my love of +1/+1 counter strategy, and I fully endorse Isengard Unleashed as a great card for red decks. If you already have the Elven Council or the Hosts of Mordor precons, then the Galadriel or Witch King scenes are a great buy for you because then you can just slot the cards from the Witch King straight into the precon, and you can easily turn the Elf deck into a Bant colored commander by using this Galadriel as the front face, and then add white to that precon and go with a three color instead of a two-color deck. So thank you for spending some time with me as we go through these scenes. I love the Lord of the Rings cards, and these are just giving me more good feels as we go through these products. That said, I'm going to try to come up with some commander decks that are based around these scene cards and the commanders that they're going to give us for them. Until those come out, we'll see you in the next one, and have a great day.